it's important to train deacons, first of all, because there's a lot of different perspectives on what deacons do in the history of the church. And I think, for example, in the Catholic and the Episcopal tradition, and somewhat in the Methodist tradition, deacons have been viewed as sort of a stepping stone to the priestly office or to the office of pastor, or as the pastor's assistant in worship. And so that's part of the church tradition. And yet in the Reformed tradition really sought to recover the role of deacons in ministering to the material welfare of the church body and of our neighbors and our neighborhoods. And so Calvin, for example, and Luther really sought to undergird the ministry of all believers, and that God gives gifts to all believers, and took us back to Acts chapter 6, where there began to be sort of a partnership of word and deed ministry together. And so Stephen and Philip and the others of the seven were given the ministry of distributing the food to those at tables, and that allowed for Peter and the other apostles to really focus on the ministry of the Word. And so that was somewhat recovered in the Reformed tradition. And so because these misconceptions can develop, I think it's important for every generation to really go back to the Scriptures and go back to looking at what God's design is for both word and deed ministry together. You know, in 1 Peter chapter 5, in chapter 4, in 1 Peter chapter 4, we get this distinction between gifts of speaking and gifts of serving. And Peter says, if you have gifts of speaking, speak as the very oracles of God. And so the elders really have that ministry and gifts of speaking and teaching. But we also have those who have gifts of serving. And he says, serve with the strength of God to demonstrate to one another the variegated grace of God, both in word and in deed. So we need to go back to the Scriptures, but we also need to look at examples in the history of the church. We learn by the examples of others, and we learn from appreciating the differences in context, both in history and culture, of what others are doing in diaconal ministry. So I think if we're first going to study the Scriptures, we also could benefit from looking at examples in the history of the church. Examples like Calvin and the church at Geneva, in a time when a lot of refugees were coming into Switzerland from France, and to see how Calvin and the council in Geneva organized deacons to interview the refugees, to understand who had certain skills to help them get placed in jobs, those who were disabled, that they would be supported by the church, that their children would be put in schools, and that schools would be developed for children. And then even to see that ministry funded by the French. They experienced many of the same sorts of pressures on social services that we experience in North America, of having immigrants and refugees come to us. And so they raised money. They raised money from the French who had come and who'd been there. Calvin himself was a French refugee. And so they contributed from their own wealth to start this separate fund to help the refugees that were coming in. About 300 years later, we have the example of Thomas Chalmers in Glasgow in Scotland, and how St. John's Church, again, sort of divided up the parish into districts. And deacons would go and do home visits and get to know the people in their parish, many of whom were not Christians. So they didn't wait for the poor to come to them. They took the initiative to serve their community. So we learn about what it means to be a deacon from the Scriptures, from examples in the history of the church. But I think most of all, we learn by doing. And so I think if I were a pastor in a local church, beginning to see and shepherd a process of nominations for deacon, I would teach my congregation, look at those around you who are already deaconing. Who are those already serving? And those are the ones that really should be nominated. And then as the deacons lead the congregation, They teach us from the Scriptures, but they also invite us and equip us to serve our communities and to serve one another. So one of the things we're going to do in our course on diaconal training is we're going to have a day of service in the weekend following that course called City Serve, where we at Covenant Seminary and in the churches around St. Louis can just come alongside our neighbors to serve our city and assist our churches as we serve our neighbors as well.